Welcome to the Africa Caribbean Reasoning Series, hosted by the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa Caribbean Advocacy here at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. I am your host, Sharon Bogues Wolf, and I invite you to join me every month for a new reasoning led by our distinguished scholars. UWI-TV will rebroadcast our programs at different times, and I invite you to check the UWI-TV schedule in your area so you do not miss this very interesting series. Today, our distinguished scholar is Professor Anthony Bogues, the Asa Messer Professor of Humanities and Africana Studies, and a professor in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Brown University. He is a visiting professor and curator at Johannesburg University. He was recently appointed Distinguished Professor at Large at the Africa Institute in Sharjah, UAE. He has worked on numerous projects with international agencies and is currently the convener of the UNESCO project, Mapping Global Anti-Black Racism. He is the inaugural director at the Ruth Simmons Center for Slavery and Justice at Brown University. His work continues to focus on the Caribbean intellectual tradition, and he has done extensive work on C.L.R. James, Sylvia Wynter, Stuart Hall, and George Lamin. Professor Bogues is a prolific writer and has contributed numerous articles and is an associate editor of the Caribbean journal, BIM. Welcome, Professor Bogues.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this reasoning.
Prof, when people hear the term Caribbean intellectual tradition, what does it mean? How would you explain it to them?
The Caribbean intellectual tradition is a body of ideas, of practices, creative practices, which include dance, performance, art, as well as music, of practices of politics, literature, and therefore it is a body of ideas and practices of all these things that we in the Caribbean do, and all human beings do, art, literature, and so on. And when we say Caribbean intellectual tradition, what we mean is that these are practices and ideas and novels and plays and so on and music that emerge from the Caribbean, that emerge from the history of the Caribbean, that expresses ideas about human life, that expresses ideas about politics, about art and music, but that come out of the Caribbean. And when I say it comes out of the Caribbean, it comes out of the historical experiences of the Caribbean. That historical experience in which there are two main social forces. One was colonialism, and whichever colonialism, Spanish, British, French, and the other one was racial slavery. And so all those two phenomena really created the Caribbean. They are what some people would call the midwife of the Caribbean, and we were born in that. In those two historical processes. Those processes are over 400 years old, or have a life of 400 years old, but what those processes have done is that they have created what some of us have called a civilization. That heart of that Caribbean civilization are the set of ideas, as I said, whether they are in music, whether they're in politics, whether they're in literature, which then constitutes a tradition. And so the Caribbean intellectual tradition is this body of ideas and this body of practices that emerges out of our Caribbean experience.
What it is you seem to be saying is that it is really who we are. It is our being. Being human.
It is who we are, but it is also the way I like to put it sometimes is what we are. In other words, the who tends to be about, okay, you are a Jamaican, you are a Trinidadian, you are, a Barbadian, you come from the Bahamas and so on, or you're from the Dutch Caribbean, or you're a Cuban, or you're a Haitian. And that's the kind of who that is. It tends to focus on nationality. The what focuses on what it is you have done. And so what I like to think about is what are the set of ideas, what are the set of practices, what are the things that we have done that constitutes this tradition and then constitutes the actual civilization that we can call a Caribbean civilization. And it is not just English. I want to make that point. It is, you have to, when I say Caribbean, for me, I'm thinking about the Hispanic, I'm thinking about the Dutch, I'm thinking about the Francophone, Caribbean. And so that it is, we had all these colonial masters, and many of us in the region speak different European languages besides speaking our own Creole language. But what is, I think, important is to understand that there's a relationship between all of us, even though sometimes we don't understand it and we don't pay attention to it, and that this relationship is historically formed, but very importantly has consequences for us today in the world.
We're really going on a trajectory here, and we're hoping that people who are listening to us and seeing us are beginning to understand when we talk about the Caribbean intellectual tradition. Who would you say would be the foremost practitioners, or who talks about the Caribbean intellectual tradition? Who the writers and all the other persons, the intellectuals who practice this?
Yeah, that's a difficult question because it means privilege and picking a whole set of people. So let me do something that probably is a little unusual in discussing the tradition. There are major individuals, particularly in the 20th century that we can think of. C.L.R. James, George Lamin, as Sylvia Wynter. And then, I will put in that lot Michael Manley, quite frankly, who's a major political intellectual, in my view. Eric Williams, whose book Capitalism and Slavery really redefined how we studied Atlantic history, how we study the Caribbean and history as well, and how we study history generally, and the history of, particularly history of slavery in the Atlantic world. But then, then there's, there are people like Fernando Ortiz from Cuba, Wilfred Alam, the artist from Cuba. And, one could just go on and name a whole host of people. But what I want to do that might be more important is to think about what are the, what we call system of thought and practices that come out of the region that are important. One of the things that is important to the Caribbean intellectual tradition is music. We don't think of music as an intellectual activity. We think of music as entertainment, all right? But Bob Marley was a poet. Mighty Sparrow was a poet, is a poet, right, from Trinidad. Gabby from Barbados is a poet. You just have to listen to their lyrics. So what I'm saying is that reggae music, calypso music, are products of a Caribbean intellectual tradition that we would need to pay attention to, right? There are intellectual products, even though we dance them and we love them and we think of them only as music. They're not just music, and they're not just message musics. They are our musicians, our serious musicians, some of them who I've just named, are what? Are actually poets who put music to the lyrics that they have written. So that's one. So there's a way in which, and that is really also important because increasingly in, say, literary field, people are recognizing oral poetry. Okonuro, for example, was one of the, from Jamaica, what we now call it dub poetry. Linton Kwesi Johnson from England, but who really has a Jamaican roots in Clarendon. So that it is, you have to begin to think about, you have to redefine some of these things and understand that it is part of a set of ideas and experiences that come out. So some music. I would argue that Rex Neckerford is that dance is part of this. So the work that Neckerford did in Trinidad, in Jamaica, the work that comes out of Trinidad, the works that comes out, the national ballets that come out of Cuba and so on, that all of this is part of the actual traditions. And then I want to say something that may kind of make people feel uncomfortable, but which I think is something we need to look at. One significant thing that Africans did when they came to the so-called New World that we don't pay attention to, because we just take it for granted, is that they actually formed religions. The African who came over to the New World brought with him or her the gods that they had in their head. And with these gods, what they did was that they adapted them and reworked them for the new situation. The new situation was both slavery and colonialism. And so that when we look at Afro-religion, Afro-Caribbean religion, Santeria, Voodoo, etc., Pentecostalism, and so on, Kumina, and all, revivalism, Manism, all those kind. When we, Shouter Baptist, when we look at those kind of those religions and those practices, what you are seeing is not just religion as we understand it. What you are also seeing is actually the creation of something new, something that our ancestors had to create as a way in which they could make sense of their lives under colonialism and racial slavery. I would want to argue that that is actually a profound contribution to world civilization that we have not yet taken, on board. And so, I'm here not asking people to be religious or not. I'm saying that looking at what our people have created, particularly our people of African descent have created, and then saying to ourselves, okay, in the midst of all this catastrophe called colonialism and racial slavery, this is what we created. We created a different cosmology. You may not agree with the cosmology at all. You may be this, you may be that, as a practicing Christian or whatever, but you cannot not recognize that this is a set of cosmologies that have been created by people. Importantly, out of those cosmologies that have been created have come our most important artists. Right? Some of our most important artists, not all of them. I mean, one of those cosmologies that was created was Rastafari. You cannot think of reggae music or of Jamaican music and its transition from ska, or from mento into ska and then ska into reggae and into a certain kind of dancehall, right? And some of the dancehall folks, people like Sizzler and Capleton and so on. You can't, and the younger ones, a Protege or a Chronics. You can't think of those kind of things without not thinking of Rastafari. So that therefore, if you are thinking about our intellectual tradition and you're thinking about that stream of it, which is the musical stream, right? You have to go back to the religious cosmologies that were created, that then give the rich resource to these artists, right? To an artist like Ras Daniel Hartman or an artist like Dizzy, right? And to other artists, various artists who were not necessarily Rastas, but influenced by, okay? So you have to say that what is what is this phenomenon? And this is a phenomenon not just of religion, it's an intellectual phenomenon. It is a phenomenon that reconstructs the world from a black perspective. Again, you don't have to agree with it, that's not the point. And then in reconstructing the world, it does something for the Caribbean, right? I mean, what Rastafari did for the entire Caribbean is that it put Africa on the table. Right? Africa had been put on the table from the early 20th century, the work of Marcus Garvey, but in the moment of independence in the 60s, right throughout Anglophone Caribbean, and then in the post-independence period, you cannot think of life of any Caribbean without not thinking of Rastafari, or of black life without not thinking of Rastafari and their seminal contribution. And the contribution is through popular music and through art, but it is also a religious contribution.
We're learning as we listen to you, Professor Bogues. Really interesting, because I don't believe that a lot of persons consider Rastafari, consider all music to be intellectual. It's just something that we dance to, that we enjoy, we love it, we know it's good. But it also seems to be a way of coping with this new landscape that our ancestors came to. And therefore, it went right through the ages, and we built on it until this moment.
Yeah, we do that, but it is also what I've argued in stuff I have written is that intellectual traditions, all intellectual traditions, whether it is Europe or come out of Russia, there is a Russian intellectual tradition. If you want to understand Putin, you need to understand that tradition, in my view. There's obviously, a German intellectual tradition, which a lot of people still learn, and so on and so forth. But one of the things I've argued is that intellectual traditions are built upon human experiences through history, but that are built upon human experiences through history as people ask questions about themselves and about how they're trying to live. Okay, and if that's what you're saying, then what I've argued is that essentially intellectual traditions are not just ideas as we understand them. That intellectual traditions are also practices. And that what I am trying to say is that if you do something, it is an action. But we like to think that, okay, we just do the action and that's it. I would want to argue that the actual, what one would call the deed, that the deed and the word have a relationship. So that you are making music, you are making art, you are writing a novel, and so on. All those things are something you are doing, but that doing is not just painting and taking a guitar or beating it. That doing requires a certain set of ideas, a certain form of thinking, right? In the same way I was talking about Afro-Caribbean religious things. And so that therefore is, I don't make a distinction, and this I learned, quite frankly, from two people, C.L.R. James and George Lammid. I don't make a distinction between the doers and the thinkers, right? I think that is important to understand the tradition in which both so-called doers and thinkers are working together, right? But that also doing is also thinking, right? So that's why, this is why you hear me say, I began by talking about is a body of idea and practices. Because for me, the questions of practice is also a practice of thought. And so in response to your question is that, Africans who came into this part of the world and came here in the largest forced migration in human history that we know of, had to make do. Right? Had to create something, had to create a life. They were said not to be human, okay? That's one of the ideas about slavery and racial slavery and colonialism, black people not being human. Black people then had to do what? Had to recast themselves as being human, to themselves first, right? And then to the rest of the society and to the world. And so one of the things that we have to always think about is what are these contributions that have been made by people, by black folks, people of African descent, also people in Africa, but in the Caribbean, people of African descent, in which what they are trying to do is to recast themselves, to reshape themselves, refashion themselves into human beings, and in doing that, making significant contributions to the world, to world culture and to world civilization.
Professor Bogues, I just know that our audience are just taking on all the things you have said, because it makes some of us just start to think again about what the Caribbean intellectual tradition means. And it encompasses life and all the practices, all the things that we have been doing. And I know some of us never thought of it that way. You mentioned earlier about the other traditions. What can you say about the European intellectual tradition? Or, well, you mentioned Russia, but I'm interested in the European intellectual tradition.
The European intellectual tradition, we know a lot about. You just have to go to, I mean, when my days in high school, that's what you studied, European history. I don't think we started West Indian history until about when I was in fifth form. And then certainly in sixth form, one was doing English literature. I mean, my great poets. I mean, the two poets that I really liked was very much William Blake and Yeats, the Irish poet. I still, quite frankly, read Yeats. There's something about the Irish poet, that poet, and particularly as he thinks about Ireland, and which was a colony of England, okay? And there's something about James Joyce as well, and some of the things he has, and some of the novels he has written, Portrait of the Artist and so on. But the European the thing about the European intellectual tradition is this. The European intellectual tradition comes together as a tradition. It has many streams. So you have the English, you have the French, you have the German, you have the Scottish, and so on. But I think it comes together as a tradition in the kind of 17th, what is called different enlightenments, French Enlightenment, Scottish Enlightenment. And so you're talking about 17th centuries, 18th century, but particularly 18th century. But when it comes together as a tradition, right, it comes together in the context of its practice in racial slavery and colonialism. One. Secondly, it comes together as a tradition when it begins to ask itself, it's a set of questions about who are we as they were colonizing and capturing African slaves. And in doing that, the question of whiteness begins to emerge. One. And so what happens is that the intellectual European tradition very much becomes preoccupied with two things. With the European and what the European does and his or her practices, which is legitimate, I can't quarrel with that. But very importantly, it becomes a tradition which then begins to parade itself as the universal tradition. So everybody is measured from standards of beauty to ideas to music to everything. Everybody is essentially understood and classified within that European tradition according to the so-called universal tradition, what George Lamin calls Europe as a universal teacher, okay? So that tradition, I think, has produced people, some of whom I still read, and I never say don't read, right? But I think that is important to understand that tradition also has many blind spots to it. That it could not recognize colonialism and racial slavery, right? And therefore classified black people in a certain way and create what we now call anti-black racism, one. But secondly, that tradition then created certain concepts of life, of what is modern, who is backward, right? Who is not backward, etc. and then begins to, and then those ideas then filter down to many of us in many ways. And so while I recognize that European tradition as something that has done certain things, I want to take the position that a Caribbean writer from Martinique, Frantz Fanon, takes. And what Fanon says in his book In Wretched of the Earth, in the very last chapter, the conclusion, the six most, when I teach it, I argue, this is the six most remarkable pages of political thought and theory that you will read anywhere. 6 pages for that conclusion. And what he says is that, he says, Europe is essentially exhausted. He says, let us leave Europe and do something else. Let us not try and follow Europe. And then he says, let's not try and follow America, which has followed Europe has become this monster. All right? And so that therefore, the question of us in the world today, of humanity, the human species, revolves around certain things. Revolves around climate change. All right? So are we going to destroy Earth so that, in a couple of, we don't know how long, this place will no longer be habitable, quite frankly, all right? Some people know this, very, very rich people know this, and they are trying to have their own spaceships to go and see where they can settle, right? But we are here, right? So we have to think about climate change and what that means and how we can stop it or change, begin to at least shift some of it so that we can live here. The second on this thing called Earth, the second major problem, other problem that faces us, is one of profound inequalities. And those inequalities are inequalities between people in societies, Jamaica, etc., various Caribbean countries, but also deep inequalities between countries of the world, all right? Of who holds the handle and who holds the blade, right? To put it simply. And part of that has to do with what is called debt, and how much money we owe, and who owns the debt, and how much we have paid back, and how much money we have not paid back, and so on and so forth. But also, I think there's a third thing, which there are many, but there's a third thing, and that has to do with war. The way in which there are many wars around the world that we don't pay attention to. We all got, our attention is riveted to Gaza, right? Because it's in the media and so on and so forth. But there are wars in Sudan, there's wars in Yemen, there's wars between Russia and Ukraine and so on, right? And the reason is not just for us in the Caribbean. We say, oh, chow, that's far away. It's not so far away. It's not so far away if you look when people are threatened to throw nuclear things at each other, right? Because a kind of nuclear bomb doesn't say, oh, well, we're not. It doesn't have do not touch Jamaica on it, or do not touch Cuba on it. So it doesn't have that, right? It will destroy parts of the world or cities in the world, and we know that. And it's there are too many countries that have access to these weapons, right? And we need to think about actually what that means, because it's for the species. Now, how does this come back to the Caribbean intellectual tradition and come back to somebody like Fanon and Amy Césaire, who's from Martinique, or Sylvia Winter, who's born in Cuba and grew up in Jamaica, or even from the Rastafarians, or even from certain spirits, quite frankly, who operate in the voodoo pantheon in Haiti. The question, therefore, of what we are as human beings. Right? What has happened is that the European intellectual tradition, what we call Western tradition, intellectual tradition, along with a system called capitalism, let me name it, has essentially created a human being who everything is homo economicus and profit. Everything is about homo economicus and profit. It is not, so it's not even about how AI can make a difference in a way that can help medicine or do that, and it can if you think about it. It's about how things like artificial intelligence and so on, who can make money off it. Right? And I'm not against, I'm not saying money is not important. That's not, I'm not stupid. But the question is that when you subordinate human life to profit and to consistent generation of profit, then everything, you mess up the world. That's how the world was messed up. That's how you began to get the things that damage the climate. That's how you began to get, a world in which nobody was caring about human beings or was caring about the environment. And just chop down things or do whatever one needs to do, or what they thought they needed to do, right, to level things and so on. That's what created the climate. What created the climate change was and the danger that we face was the consistent drive for profit. In the Caribbean intellectual tradition, and I want to say the radical part of it, because all intellectual traditions have different aspects to it. In the radical part of it says that we must put human beings first. And if you put human beings first, right, what we are, what we can become, the freedom that we need to have, the freedom that, quite frankly, black people put on the table first, because we were enslaved. If you put all of that on the table first, right, then you have to ask yourself, okay, how can we change this world? So for me, in the Caribbean intellectual tradition is not just a tradition about history. It's an active living tradition that puts on the table certain things, right? How do we sing redemption songs? All you sing redemption song is to think about us as human beings and what we need to do, not about creating a world that is solely driven and primarily driven by profit.
Wow, Professor Bogues, you have really taken us on a journey of self-reflection, and to see where we are headed and what the things that we should have started to think about if we are looking at change in the world. We talked a little bit about the Caribbean intellectual tradition. We talked a bit of the European intellectual tradition. Can you, fairly short period of time, tell me or touch a little bit on the African intellectual tradition?
All right. The African intellectual tradition is long, and we still don't know it in full. It's long because there's something called pre-colonial Africa. We forget that the European colonial project only in Africa begins in 1884. Prior to that, there's racial slavery, but and the Atlantic slave trade. But the Atlantic slave trade is essentially the western coast of Africa, West Central Africa. There's an Indian Ocean slave trade, which we don't talk a lot about. That has to do with people like Zanzibar, places like Zanzibar, and so on. But in the middle of Africa, if you want to call it that, there's they were not touched as the way, say, a West African was touched with the Atlantic slave trade. So and even before the slave trade, which begins in the 1450s with the Portuguese, Africa existed thousands and thousands of years before that. And if we say that all people think and do things, which is where I start from, then that there is a pre-colonial African intellectual tradition. A lot of work is being done, but we still don't know enough, because the other thing that we must understand is that Africa is a continent with 50-odd countries. Yeah, Africa is not one country. It is 50-odd countries with many, many languages. So it requires a lot of work for people to now in the 21st century begin to unearth that, and this is the work of archaeologists in particular, and cultural anthropologists, I would argue, that have to do that. But let's say let's talk about the African intellectual tradition, and let's talk about, since we're here at the P.J. Patterson Institute of Caribbean and African Advocacy, let's talk about the political part of that tradition. The political side of the African intellectual tradition is a side that does many things, that has key people in it that I would want to suggest to listeners or viewers, persons they may want to read about. Everybody knows about Nelson Mandela, so let's put him aside and how great he is, so let's put him aside for a moment. How many of us know about a man called Amilcar Cabral from the Guinea-Bissau, who in my view is one of the greatest political thinkers of the 20th century, and who fought the Portuguese colonialists, but who developed a whole body of ideas and practices about democracy, a whole set of ideas about how you fight colonialism, a whole set of ideas about what he calls national liberation, and importantly, a whole set of ideas that revised radical political thinking. Right? And a set of speeches he gave, particularly in Havana in the 1960s. And how he, for example, Amilcar Cabral, thought about the ways in which Africa, right, could be an open space for what we are now calling participatory democracy. That's the kind of language we give it. But democratic forms of society where every man, woman, and picnic, right, have a say in how things impact on their lives. How can we think about a Julius Nyerere, who we should know in this country because he was very important. He's very important to us because, one of the things that has happened is that we have, and there's a young cameraman here. We have forgotten, we have neglected our history. I mean, we had a situation. This is why I say Nyerere is important, where the three world figures who were arguing in the 1970s for a new world order, a new world economic system, was Fidel Castro, Julius Nyerere, and Michael Manley. Okay, something called the New International Economic Order. So that's a tradition. But importantly, I want to go to one particular thing, because we're talking about Africa, but we're also talking about the connection. The 1945 conference that was held in Manchester was a Pan-Africanist conference held in Manchester. Who were the two driving figures of that? The two driving figures was George Padmore from Trinidad and Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana. Pan-Africanism is part of the intellectual traditions, both of the Caribbean and of Africa. Okay, and that we need to think about we need to think about that relationship, and something I might talk about on Wednesday very briefly: the ways in which both African and Caribbean came together from the beginning of the 20th century to begin to think about politics in a different way. So that there is an African tradition, and that African intellectual tradition has long history, very long history, and it does something that I think that we need to think about. It does something about politics. It thinks about politics, but it also thinks about history and what is history. And it has to think about that, or it has come to think about that, because Africa's history was interrupted twice. It was interrupted with the slave trade, and then it was interrupted with the with the Berlin Conference settlement of the 1884, and the full colonization of Africa, of everywhere except Ethiopia. Okay, and so that one of the things that you find in African history, in African intellectual tradition, is this preoccupation with history, and interrupted history, and questions of how do you reclaim history, and so on. It's also part of the Caribbean intellectual tradition, but very much something that Africans do, that Africans on the continental Africans have to think about. And then the other thing I think is that the African intellectual tradition thinks very carefully about literature, right? You just and so you just have to read Ngugi wa Thiong'o, or the lyrical prose of Ivan Vera from Zimbabwe, to understand the way in which they are actually contributing to literature in ways that I would say writers in England are not.
You know, Professor Bogues, you talked about the potential role of the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa-Caribbean Advocacy. As we wrap up, what are some of the ways that you think the collaboration, the partnerships, how do you see the role of the Institute in moving forward to ensure that people from Africa, the Caribbean, and those of African descent work together, especially in this rapidly changing world?
The first thing I would want to say is that we got to know each other. That sounds actually simplistic, but each of us know 50%. If you come from Africa, you know 50%. And what you know of the Caribbean, when I go to anywhere in Africa, they'll say, where you come from? Jamaica. Bob Marley. That's what they know, okay? Or recently, Usain Bolt, right? If you come from the Caribbean and you think about Africa, you don't kind of know much about some of the things. Nelson Mandela is who you think of, but you don't think about the actual music. Or in the contemporary moment, you have a quarrel about dancehall and Afropop, without understanding the actual relationship between both. To understand how Afropop, in fact, what it was drawing from, and that you understand that, quite frankly, that the musicians will tell you that there is no barrier, that music, that when you and me get together is a music we are dealing with, right, in a certain way. And that the structure of the music comes out of reggae and so on, and dancehall in particular, obviously influence and shape, and that's how things are. That's how things work, right? Music travels in particular. Music travels and circulates in the black world in a way that we have not yet understood it. And so if we understand that there's a kind of black world and there's a circularity of music, then we begin to understand. We don't kind of get vexed. We kind of think about what can we do to collaborate? Okay, so my first thing is always about, there's a professor, Professor Augusto, who used to talk about, each of us know 50%. Right? And so we have to go beyond each of us knowing the 50%. That's the first thing. So to me, it's education. The second thing is, what are the concrete projects that we need to be thinking about together? The South African film industry has just worked through a set of negotiations about a month or two ago with Netflix and so on, where they are now beginning to do cinemas and movies and making films that do what? That will bypass Paramount and all these other people. The Caribbean is a natural place for making films. Our people love it, right? We can produce fine actors and actresses, but what we have been reduced to is location, right? You don't have time to go through that, but we are primarily a location, beautiful sceneries, beaches, hills, and so on, and so forth. What about us thinking about concrete projects between the African film industry, between Bollywood, which comes out, Nollywood, sorry, which comes out of Nigeria, and then the South Africans who are moving into this direction, to thinking about how do you form international alliances that can bypass the structures of Hollywood, right? And to begin to think about movies that will take off in the world. Because I think that, to use this word, there's going to be people want to see this. There's a market for those kind of things, right? Particularly because people have streaming and so on. So my point is concrete projects. Education and concrete projects. Then there is the third thing, right, which I think is important. I'm going to just talk about three. What are the ways in which the Institute can begin to facilitate dialogue around concrete political international issues, as well as economic issues that need to happen, so that the question of debt is something that all of us have. Right? All of us have this problem of debt. How do we work together to begin to think through a different renegotiation of debt? Renegotiation of debt is important because why? If you don't have fiscal space to do certain things in your country because you pay back too much money, then that's a concrete thing. Then there's the other concrete thing is to think about, okay, what are the major political problems in the world? Gaza. So how does the Institute then facilitate conversations between Africa and the Caribbean around these things? How do we know about each other? 50%, getting rid of the 50% from each other. How do we have concrete projects? And how do we have international political and economic projects? If we can do those three things, we can facilitate those three things, then I think it would have made a significant contribution.
Professor Bogues, we have our work cut out for us. And we're so happy that you were able to join us today. You know, the Institute has implemented a Distinguished Scholars and Fellows program that brings together academics, researchers, authors, and creatives to share their perspectives on issues related to economic, cultural, social development of Africa, the Caribbean, and the African diaspora. The Institute will always reach out to fellow academics, engage persons from Africa and the region to identify areas of mutual benefit and note the legacy of the slave trade, racial slavery, and the fight for global reparations. We must encourage cultural and business exchanges and encourage dialogue. The work of the Institute is centered on empowerment of our people and the 68 countries of Africa and the Caribbean. And so we want to thank you, Professor Bogues, again for this very, very interesting, eye-opening, and almost trying to map for us a pathway for collaboration between peoples of African descent and showing us how the various intellectual traditions are important to how we see ourselves and how we decide to walk through the world with our heads held high. And so we're so glad to have you on board here at the Institute, and we definitely would like you to know that we will let you know, rather, when this will be aired so that you'll be able to share it with others. And so it is clear that the Institute will bring people and ideas together. The African continent and our region will be exposed to the perspectives of our distinguished scholars and authors as to how best we can bring our ethnic and familial ties to benefit us all. This program was produced by the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa-Caribbean Advocacy at the University of the West Indies. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you again.